In 1970, Britain still ended the day with steam rising from a pudding basin, not a plastic tray. Kitchens smelled of treacle, vanilla, burnt sugar, and warm bread instead of frozen dinners and microwave heat. Every evening, mothers and grandmothers created desserts so rich, comforting, and unforgettable that they became part of family memory itself. But then something changed. Factories arrived with convenience. Advertisements sold speed over tradition. And slowly, the puddings that once ruled British tables disappeared from everyday life. Not because people stopped loving them, but because modern life made people forget how to make them. These are the lost puddings of Britain, 30 forgotten masterpieces almost erased from history. Number 30. Bread and butter pudding. Not the restaurant version with brioche and crème anglaise that a Mayfair bistro charges £14 for. The real one. You used the bread that was going stale. You spread it with margarine, real block margarine, the kind that came in a grease-proof wrapper, layered it in a baking dish with a handful of dried currants and a little nutmeg, poured over a mixture of egg and milk, and left it to soak into a moderate oven. Out again 40 minutes later, golden on top, custardy underneath, smelling of something ancient and good. In a working-class household in Leeds or Coventry in 1973, nothing was ever thrown away. Grandma just called it using up the bread. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 29. Spotted Dick. A steamed suet pudding with dried currants, served with proper custard poured over the top in a yellow flood. This is a pudding that the British once understood instinctively. Suet, the hard fat from around the kidneys, was cheap, available, and produced a texture no other fat could replicate. Dense, sturdy, warm in a way that went straight to the bones. You could buy a piece of suet from the butcher for almost nothing in the 1970s, shred it yourself, mix it with self-raising flour, sugar, and currants, wrap the whole thing in a cloth or pack it into a greased basin, and steam it for 2 hours on the back of the stove while you got on with everything else. This was not a fancy dish. This was Tuesday. The custard was birds made from powder, and nobody apologized for that. Number 28. Jam roly-poly. Another suet pudding. The British working class ran on suet in the cold months. This time rolled flat, spread with whatever jam you had in the cupboard, rolled back up into a log, wrapped in foil, and steamed or baked. Raspberry jam was the classic, strawberry if you were lucky. Sometimes plum jam from a batch someone's nan had made in August from the tree in the back garden, ladled into jars and sealed with wax, stored in the pantry until December, when the cold truly arrived, and something warm and sweet was not a luxury, but a medical necessity. The jam melts into the suet pastry during cooking. It bleeds. The cut end shows swirls of red through pale dough. Children went silent when it arrived at the table. Number 27. Steamed treacle sponge. This one requires patience. You spoon golden syrup into the bottom of a pudding basin, a real pudding basin, heavy ceramic, the kind that weighed half a pound empty. Cover it with a plain sponge batter, seal the top with greaseproof paper and a double layer of foil tied down with string, and lower it into a pan of simmering water for 90 minutes. What comes out is extraordinary. You invert on a plate and the treacle, which has been sitting underneath the sponge the entire time, slowly thickening, slowly caramelizing in the heat, runs down the sides in long amber threads. The sponge underneath is the color of dark honey. The smell fills the entire house. In 1972, golden syrup cost 14 pence a tin. A pudding basin bought from Woolworths lasted 30 years. This was not an expensive dessert. This was the kind of thing a miner's wife in County Durham made on a Sunday, and the family ate it in silence because there was nothing to say. Number 26. Cabinet pudding. This one has almost completely vanished, even from memory. A molded steamed pudding made from layers of sponge cake or dry rationed biscuits, glacé cherries, and a simple egg custard poured over everything in the basin before steaming. The name comes from the Victorian era. By the 1970s, it had already faded from fashionable cooking, But working class and lower middle class households in the Midlands and the North still made it because it was clever in a way that mattered. It used up stale cake, it used up dry biscuits. It stretched a few eggs and a pint of milk into something that looked, when turned out of its mold onto a plate, genuinely impressive. Grandma just called it the pudding with the cherries in. The cherries sank to the bottom of the basin during steaming, which meant they ended up on top when you turned it out. Presentation sorted, nothing bought, nothing wasted. Number 25, Queen of Puddings. If you've never had it, you cannot imagine what it is. A base layer of breadcrumbs soaked in warm milk and egg yolk, baked until just set, then spread with a thin layer of jam, then covered entirely with a thick dome of meringue, stiff-peaked egg whites and sugar, toasted in the oven until the top is the color of pale autumn leaves. 3 textures, 3 temperatures, 1 pudding. The breadcrumb base is soft and custardy. The jam in the middle is hot and sharp. The meringue on top is crisp on the outside and marshmallow soft inside. You hit all 3 with a single spoon. In coastal Lancashire, in the 1960s and into the 1970s, this was a Sunday pudding. It took 40 minutes and cost less than 20 pence. Today you find it on gastropub menus at £9.50, described as a classic British dessert. The description is accurate. The price is a different kind of fiction. Number 24. Manchester Tart. A short crust pastry case, spread first with raspberry jam, then filled with a coconut custard made from desiccated coconut and a simple egg mixture, then baked. Served cold with a glacé cherry on top. This was a school dinner pudding across the north of England for 3 decades. It arrived on your tray in a shallow foil tin, pale yellow with a thin brown crust, that single red cherry dead center, and you either loved it or you pretended you didn't, because loving school dinner pudding was not something you admitted in 1974. In the school canteens of Manchester, Salford, Bolton, and Bury, it appeared on rotation every 2 or 3 weeks, made in industrial quantities, and it was genuinely good. Nobody makes Manchester Tart now. The school dinner ladies who knew the recipe are gone. The recipe itself has mostly gone with them. Number 23, Gypsy Tart. This one belongs specifically to Kent. Evaporated milk, the pale, slightly sweet-tinned milk that appeared in every 1970s British kitchen, whisked with dark muscovado sugar until the mixture more than doubled in volume and turned a deep caramel brown. That filling poured into a pastry case and baked just long enough to set it, but no longer, because overcooked Gypsy Tart goes grainy and loses its extraordinary mousse-like texture. The sugar content is extraordinary. A single slice is almost pure sweetness, sweet in a way that makes your back teeth ache pleasantly and your eyes close for a second. Kentish school children in the 1970s had it served to them on Fridays. Adults from Kent who encounter it for the first time in 40 years go completely quiet. It is almost never seen outside Kent. It barely exists inside Kent anymore. A tin of evaporated milk and a bag of muscovado sugar still cost less than £1.50. The recipe has been sitting right there the whole time waiting. Number 22. Semolina pudding. School dinners again, but this one was made at home too. Made properly, made with care, and it was not the gluey institutional version that left a generation of British people flinching. Whole milk, slowly heated. Semolina stirred in, fine durum wheat, the same grain that makes Italian pasta. A little sugar, a very little vanilla. Stirred continuously over a gentle heat for 15 minutes until it thickened to the consistency of soft polenta. And there it is, that word again, the same word the Italian restaurants now use to charge £8 for a small bowl. Semolina pudding was polenta's British cousin, and it cost 3 pence to make in 1971. A teaspoon of jam dropped into the center before serving. The jam sank slightly, spread a little. The whole thing was eaten warm in a bowl in front of the fire on a November evening, and it was, objectively, perfect. Not progress, it is just progress that forgot what it was replacing. Number 21, Rhubarb Crumble. You cannot discuss British puddings without this one. But the specific version that has disappeared deserves attention. Not the crumble with oats and cinnamon and brown sugar and a buttery topping that fills the pages of modern recipe books. The original crumble, the wartime crumble, invented during rationing when pastry was impossible. Not enough fat, not enough sugar. When some anonymous woman discovered that rubbing plain flour and margarine together with a handful of white sugar and scattering it over stewed fruit produced something that browned in the oven and crunched and tasted like something deserved. The rhubarb in question was forced rhubarb, the pale pink kind grown in dark sheds in the rhubarb triangle of West Yorkshire, Wakefield, Morley, Rothwell, where it had been cultivated since the 1870s using a technique unchanged for a century. Pulled by candlelight, the stalks so tender they barely needed cooking, sweetened with the minimum of sugar because sugar was precious and the natural sourness of the rhubarb was part of the point. The rhubarb triangle still exists. The sheds still operate. Most people in Britain don't know this. Number 20, spotted dog. The Irish version of a currant bread that worked equally as pudding, served warm from the oven with a thick slab of butter. This one crossed over heavily into working-class Irish immigrant communities in Birmingham, Liverpool, and Glasgow from the 1950s onwards, and became, in those households, as much a part of the weekly rhythm as any native British pudding. Plain white soda bread dough with dried fruit stirred in, sultanas, currants, the occasional raisin, shaped into a round loaf, scored across the top with a cross, baked in a hot oven for 40 minutes, served while still warm enough to melt the butter. The cross on top was traditional, functional, practical. It helped the bread expand and cook through, and in Irish households it carried a blessing that nobody stated out loud, but everybody understood. In the post-war Irish communities of English industrial cities, this was the smell of safety. The smell of home transferred to a new address. Number 19, apple charlotte. Not Charlotte Russe, that is something else entirely and belongs to a different world. Apple charlotte is a humble thing. A pudding basin lined entirely with slices of buttered stale bread, the inside filled with stewed, spiced apple, cinnamon, cloves, a little sugar, the top sealed with more buttered bread, a plate placed on top as a weight. The whole thing baked in a moderate oven until the bread casing is crisp and golden, and the apple inside has reduced to an intensely flavored, dark, fragrant compote. When you turn it out, that single perfect moment of kitchen confidence, the inversion, the brief uncertainty, then the release, it holds its shape. A dome of brown gold bread concealing hot apple. You cut into it with a spoon and the crust breaks, and the steam comes out, and the smell is November and wood smoke, and every cold Sunday afternoon you've ever sat through and come out the other side of. Apples cost almost nothing in autumn. Stale bread cost nothing. This is a pudding made entirely from things that would otherwise be thrown away. Number 18, Bakewell pudding. Not the Bakewell tart, that is the commercial, iced, cherry-topped version sold in every supermarket in Britain, and it bears only a passing resemblance to the original. The pudding, the real thing from the town of Bakewell in Derbyshire, which has been made there since at least the 1820s, according to local records, and which has a texture and character completely unlike anything the Mr. Kipling version might suggest. Puff pastry lined in a deep dish. A thick spread of strawberry or raspberry jam on the base. Over it, a filling of eggs, butter, sugar, and ground almonds, but a wetter, richer, more custardy mixture than the dry almond frangipane of the commercial tart. Baked until the top sets and takes on a slight golden color, the filling still soft and wobbly underneath. Served warm, with cream if you had it, with nothing if you didn't, and it was still extraordinary. The old original Bakewell pudding shop on the square in Bakewell has been there since the 1800s. Most people who go to Bakewell buy the tart and drive home without knowing the pudding exists. Number 17, treacle tart. golden syrup, and fresh white breadcrumbs, and the zest of a lemon stirred together and poured into a short crust pastry case, then baked until the filling sets and the top takes on a dark amber sheen that catches the light like old varnish. 5 ingredients, 40 minutes. A pudding so specifically, so unmistakably British in flavor, the sweet, slightly bitter treacle, the crumb texture, the sharp citrus cutting through, that no other cuisine in the world has ever tried to replicate it, which makes it even stranger that Britain itself has largely stopped making it. In coal mining communities in South Wales in the 1960s, this was a Saturday pudding, treacle tart and custard. The treacle came in a green and gold tin, Lyle's, which has been made in the same London factory since 1883. The tin itself is still there, still the same tin. The recipe has not changed in 140 years. The tart simply stopped being made. Number 16. Clootie dumpling. This one belongs to Scotland with a specificity that resists transplantation. But Scottish families in London, Newcastle, and Carlisle made it in their new homes and carried it south with them, and it became, in those communities, inseparable from celebration. A clootie dumpling is a large, sweet, spiced pudding made from flour, suet, dried fruit, treacle, and spices, mixed into a dough, wrapped in a floured cloth, the clout, tied at the top, and boiled in a large pot of water for 3 to 4 hours. What emerges is a dark, dense, magnificent thing, slightly firm on the outside where the flour has formed a skin, soft and moist within. The outside skin, the clootie skin, was considered a delicacy. It was fought over. A clootie dumpling was made for birthdays, hogmanay, and the depth of January when the light failed completely, and something massive and dark and sweet was what the body demanded. Coins were pressed into the dough before cooking. Finding one in your slice was luck. The tradition goes back centuries. It belongs to no restaurant. It belongs to no chef. It belongs to the women who made it. Number 15. Sago pudding. School dinners gave this one a terrible reputation, and the reputation has proven permanent. Sago, tiny white pearls from the pith of the sago palm, imported cheaply from Southeast Asia throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, cooked in whole milk with sugar until the pearls became translucent and the whole thing thickened into a soft, yielding, slightly gelatinous pudding. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. The problem was never the sago. The problem was always the cooking. Properly made sago pudding, cooked slowly, finished with a knob of butter poured into individual dishes and allowed to cool so the surface set, is a mild, comforting, quietly delicious thing. The version served in school canteens in 1971 was made in 40-gallon vats, held too long, reheated once, and arrived at your tray with the consistency of wallpaper paste and the temperature of lukewarm regret. Number 14. Eve's pudding. A deeply practical pudding with a name that carries its own quiet mythology. A base of stewed Bramley apples, tart, collapsing in the heat to a pale green compote that holds the shape of nothing and the flavor of everything. Covered with a simple sponge batter and baked until the sponge rises over the apple and turns golden, and the fruit beneath has thickened and darkened and is no longer the same thing it was when it went in. Bramley apples grew in almost every back garden in England. A tree planted in the 1960s was still producing fruit in the 1990s. More fruit than any household could use. Fruit given to neighbors. Fruit stored wrapped in newspaper in the garage. Fruit stewed and frozen. Fruit that arrived on the doorstep in paper bags from people you barely knew. Eve's pudding was how you used the apples in November, in December, in March, when the last stored fruit was going soft and something needed to be done with it before it was lost. Nothing was ever lost. Grandma just called it apple sponge. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 13. Junket. Warm milk, rennet, a little sugar. That is all. The rennet, traditionally from calves' stomachs, the same enzyme that sets cheese, causes the milk proteins to coagulate gently without heat, producing a soft, delicate, barely there set. The texture is somewhere between thick cream and the very softest possible panna cotta, but lighter than either, more fragile, more ephemeral. It shakes when you move the dish. In the West Country of England, Devon, Cornwall, Somerset, junket was a tradition that ran from the 17th century through to the mid-20th. It was served at cream teas. It was made for invalids and for children. It was eaten in summer, cold from the pantry, with a little grated nutmeg on top, and a spoonful of clotted cream, which is perhaps the single most decadent thing you can do with a food that costs almost nothing to make. It disappeared almost entirely when pasteurized milk became universal. Rennet requires living enzymes to work properly, and pasteurization alters the milk's protein structure just enough to make the set unreliable. You can still make it. It is simply less forgiving than it used to be. Grandma just called it a junket. She set it in the larder on a Tuesday and forgot about it. She was right. Everything she knew was right. Number 12. Boiled fruitcake pudding. Different from a Christmas pudding. Lighter in color, less intensely spiced, faster to make, more suited to any Tuesday in November than to a single ceremonial December moment. Mixed dried fruit, sultanas, currants, raisins, mixed peel, simmered first with water, margarine, and sugar for 20 minutes, then left to cool. Self-raising flour, mixed spice, and egg beaten in. The whole mixture poured into a greased tin and baked. Or, in the older tradition, poured into a greased pudding basin and boiled in a pan of water for 90 minutes, which produces a moister, denser, darker result. In Scotland and the north of England, this was made in October and eaten through the winter. A tin of it sat on the kitchen counter under a piece of grease-proof paper. You cut slices of it cold, buttered heavily. You ate it with strong tea. You did not need anything else. The fruit provided sugar, the egg provided protein. The margarine provided fat, the spice provided warmth from the inside. A pound of mixed fruit cost 14 pence in 1972. The resulting cake fed a family for a week. Number 11. Sussex Pond Pudding. This is the one that confounds people most. The one where the magic is structural, built into the recipe itself. And when it works, it's extraordinary. And when it's described to someone who has never had it, they simply don't believe it's real. A suet pastry case lined into a basin. Inside, a whole lemon, unwaxed, a proper lemon, placed in the center, surrounded entirely by butter and demerara sugar. The basin sealed with a suet pastry lid, tied down, steamed for 3 to 4 hours, then inverted onto a plate. What has happened during those 3 hours? The butter and sugar have melted together, the lemon has cooked through entirely, its skin softened, its juice releasing slowly into the butter-sugar mixture. When you cut into the pudding at the table, a pond of lemon butter sugar sauce flows out from the center, hence the name. The lemon at the heart of it is eaten too, skin, pith, and all. The bitterness transformed by 3 hours of heat into something complex and extraordinary. This is a pudding that requires confidence, that requires faith. It rewards both absolutely. Number 10. Frumenti. The oldest pudding on this list by several centuries. Cracked or whole wheat grains, simmered in milk with saffron, sugar, and dried fruit, until the greens swell and soften, and the milk thickens around them into a golden, fragrant porridge. Eaten at feast days and holidays from the medieval period onwards, present in English cookery books from the 1400s through to the early 1900s, still served in rural Yorkshire and Lincolnshire, at harvest festivals living memory can attest to. It was gone from most tables by 1950. By 1975, it was a historical curiosity. By 2000, it was virtually unknown. Today, the whole grains industry sells cracked wheat as bulgur. Restaurants serve wheatberry salads with pomegranate and feta and charge £12. Frumenti is what British people called wheatberry pudding for 700 years before anyone thought to repackage it as Middle Eastern grain cuisine. It is the same grain, the same saffron, the same slow cooking in milk. The price has merely been multiplied by 30. Number 9. Brown Betty. Not to be confused with the American version, this is a British pudding with its own distinct character. A baking dish buttered, a layer of stewed or raw sliced apple, a layer of buttered breadcrumbs mixed with brown sugar and a little cinnamon, another layer of apple, another layer of crumbs dotted with butter. Baked until the top layer of crumbs turns deeply golden and smells of warm toffee, and the apple underneath has collapsed into a sweet, fragrant pool. Simpler than a crumble, fewer steps than a pie. No pastry to make, nothing that could go wrong. A brown Betty was the pudding a tired woman made on a Wednesday evening with yesterday's bread, and the apples in the bowl that were beginning to go soft. The soft apples were better for it. More juice, more collapse, more flavor from the concentrated sugars. In the North Midlands in the 1960s, this was a weekly event in houses with fruit trees. Every house with a garden had a fruit tree. Apples were not a purchased ingredient. Apples were something you walked outside and picked. Number 8. Egg custard tart. The real one. Not the Portuguese pastel de nata that the high street chains sell at $2.80 each, and whose flaky pastry and slightly burnt top have become the default British understanding of what a custard tart is. The English egg custard tart. Short crust pastry, not puff, not flaky, baked blind first until pale gold, then filled with a mixture of whole eggs, egg yolks, full-fat milk, cream if you had it, and nothing else except a pinch of nutmeg grated on top, then returned to a very low oven and cooked slowly, until the custard just set and barely trembled. The nutmeg is not optional. The nutmeg is the thing. The specific combination of warm egg custard and freshly grated nutmeg is one of the oldest flavor pairings in British cooking. Present in cookery manuscripts from the 1600s, utterly distinctive, impossible to confuse with anything else. They were sold in every bakery in Britain through the 1970s, singly in a small foil case, 12 pence. You bought one and ate it walking home in the cold, and it was warm from the oven, and the nutmeg hit the back of your nose, and that was enough. That was entirely enough. Number 7. Marmalade pudding. The cousin of the steamed treacle sponge, made in exactly the same way, steamed in exactly the same basin, but with orange marmalade where the treacle was. Spooned into the bottom of the greased basin first, the sponge batter poured over the top, sealed, steamed for 90 minutes, then inverted. The marmalade at the base becomes the topping. It goes dark during steaming, slightly jammy, the orange peel softening until it is almost translucent, the bitter-sweet character of a good marmalade intensifying rather than diminishing in the heat. The smell, steam and orange and hot sugar, is its own form of nostalgia even before you've tasted it. In Scottish households and in London's East End, marmalade pudding was a winter staple from the 1940s through the 1970s. Dundee marmalade was considered the finest. Cooper's Oxford marmalade, in its distinctive jar, was a luxury. Frank Cooper's had been making it in Oxford since 1874. The recipe survived the war. It survived rationing. It did not survive the Angel Delight. Number 6. Boiled baby, the old name for a suet roly-poly boiled in a cloth rather than baked in the oven. The name is blunt and a little terrible and entirely British in the way it refuses to dress something up. The same rolled suet pudding as the roly-poly of number 28, but wrapped tightly in a floured cloth tied at both ends and dropped into a pot of boiling water for 2 hours. The cloth leaves its mark on the outside. A slight cloth weave texture pressed into the surface, the whole thing pale and slightly glistening when you unwrap it at the table. You cut it in slices. The jam inside has become something else entirely during those 2 hours, deeper, darker, more concentrated, almost a preserve rather than a jam now. This method is older than ovens. Women in industrial Lancashire mill towns boiled their puddings on the fire because they had no oven, or their oven was being used for bread, or coal was too expensive to heat an oven when the fire was already burning. The pot was always on. Pot cost nothing extra. The pudding went in, and 2 hours later it came out, and that was dinner's end solved. Number 5. Flummery, a word that has almost entirely lost its original meaning. In contemporary English, flummery means nonsense, empty talk, hollow ceremony. In the British kitchen from the 17th century through to the early 20th, it meant something specific and beautiful. Originally a Welsh and English dish of steeped oats, oatmeal soaked in water for days until fermented slightly, then boiled down to a thick, slightly sour, gelatinous pudding eaten with honey or cream. By the 18th century, the name had migrated to a cream pudding set with hartshorn or isinglass. By the 19th century, it was a jelly made from almond or lemon. By the 1950s, it appeared occasionally in Welsh farmhouse kitchens as a thick, sweet oat cream, eaten cold, poured over summer fruit. By 1975, it was gone so completely that most people had no idea it had ever been food. The word remained. The pudding did not. A language kept the ghost of a dish while the dish itself evaporated. Number 4. Hasty pudding. The name tells you everything about its philosophy. No time, no fuss, something warm in 10 minutes. Wheat flour or oatmeal stirred into boiling milk or water until it thickened, sweetened with sugar or treacle, eaten immediately. The oldest pudding on this list, and possibly the oldest dessert in the British repertoire, recorded in English cookery books from the 1600s. Eaten by agricultural laborers, mill workers, and miners' families across 4 centuries because it could be made from the cheapest possible ingredients with no equipment beyond a pot and a fire and a wooden spoon. In County Durham's mining communities in the 1930s, a pot of hasty pudding with a little butter stirred in at the end was a child's supper 3 nights a week. It is, in practical terms, what the French call bouillie, what Americans called mush, what Italians developed into polenta, what West Africans made as fufu. The same impulse, the same solution to the same human problem. Grain, heat, milk, sweetness, comfort. This was not poor food. This was genius. Every grandmother who made it was right. Number 3. Groaty pudding. This one belongs to the Black Country, the industrial heartland of the West Midlands, the area of Dudley, Wolverhampton, Tipton, and Walsall, where steel and iron and glass and chain-making built one of the most intensely working-class cultures in Britain and also quietly produced one of its most distinctive local foods. Groats hold whole oat grains, soaked overnight, then slow-cooked with leeks, onion, and shin beef for 6 to 8 hours in a very low oven. This is technically a savory dish, but it was eaten as a complete meal. It was traditionally made on bonfire night and left in the oven all day, and it served the function in those communities that a pudding served elsewhere. It was the warm, filling, slow-made thing that ended the day and sent people to bed satisfied. A pound of groats in 1965 cost 4 pence. A piece of shin beef could be had from the butcher for almost nothing. Fed 6 people. Took almost no active labor, it sat in the oven and asked nothing of you for hours. Here's what the food industry doesn't want you to know. Slow cooking cheap cuts with whole grains provides more collagen, more gelatin, more slow-release energy, and a more sustained feeling of satiety than any ready meal ever manufactured. The Black Country grandmothers, who made groaty pudding for bonfire night, knew things about cheap nutrition that the entire supplement industry is still trying to catch up with. Number 2, damson cheese, not a dairy cheese. A fruit cheese. An intensely flavored, almost solid preserve made by cooking damson plums to a pulp, pressing them through a sieve to remove the stones and skins, then cooking the pulp down with sugar for a very long time until the mixture is so thick it begins to pull away from the sides of the pan, and when set in a mold and cooled, holds its shape. Turned out onto a plate, it looks like a dark jewel. Sliced thin because thin is how you eat it, it has a purple-black color that catches light like stained glass. The flavor is intensely concentrated damson, that specific tart-sweet astringent character that damsons alone possess, sharpened and deepened by the long cooking, utterly unlike jam, utterly unlike jelly, something in between a confection and a condiment and a dessert. In Westmoreland and the Lythe Valley in Cumbria, damson orchards have grown since the 17th century. The valley still produces damsons. The cheese is still made by a handful of families. The rest of Britain has entirely forgotten it exists. Damson cheese was eaten with a slice of hard cheese, a Lancashire, or a Cheshire, or with cold lamb, or alone after a meal with a glass of something. It kept for a year. A jar of it was a gift that cost almost nothing and lasted 12 months and tasted like the distilled memory of every orchard September that ever was. Number 1. Blackcap pudding. This deserves the top position because it is perhaps the most visually striking, the most technically ingenious, and the most completely forgotten pudding on this entire list. A pudding basin, the base lined with currants, cooked briefly in butter, and a little black treacle until they become dark, sticky, almost lacquered. Over this, a plain sponge batter, vanilla, butter, eggs, self-raising flour, the most unassuming batter imaginable. Steamed in the usual way for 90 minutes, then inverted onto a plate. The black cap is what the currants become. During steaming, the treacle penetrates the currants, deepens them, turns them from dried fruit to something that glistens and smells of dark sugar and bitter caramel and the very edge of burning. When the pudding is inverted, this coating is the first thing you see. A perfect, gleaming, near-black disk of lacquered fruit sitting on top of a pale, innocent sponge. The contrast is dramatic. The flavor contrast matches it exactly. The barely sweet, soft vanilla sponge against the intensely dark, bittersweet cap. It was in British pudding books from at least the 18th century. It was still being made in London households in the 1960s. By 1985, it had essentially vanished. No one bought it. No one sold it. It simply stopped being made, in house after house, as the women who knew how to make it grew older, and the daughters who might have learned were busy with other things. Careers, commutes, the new convenience of a supermarket that had decided for them what dinner would be. Closing 30 puddings. 30 things that fed Britain through depression and war and rationing and the gray exhaustion of rebuilding, and then vanished in the 15 years of plenty and packaged convenience that followed. Go back through this list. Make the treacle sponge. It takes 40 ingredients, fewer than any recipe you'll find on a food blog. It takes flour, eggs, butter, and a tin of golden syrup and 90 minutes of your time. Steam the roly-poly. Make the black cap pudding and stand at your kitchen counter and watch the moment the pudding releases from its basin and the black cap catches the light, and understand in that moment that no factory in Britain has ever made anything this beautiful. These were not the desserts of people who lacked sophistication. These were the desserts of people who understood, completely and precisely, what food was for, what it did. What it meant to put something warm and sweet and made by hand in front of the people you loved at the end of a day that had asked too much of them. The grandmothers who knew these recipes were not domestic servants. They were not trapped. They were skilled. They were scientists of the hearth. They understood how heat transformed grain, how time transformed fruit, how patience turned the cheapest possible ingredients into something that tasted like it cost 10 times what it did. They knew things about feeding people that we will spend the next 50 years trying to remember. In 1979, Marks & Spencer launched convenience desserts and spent £3 million telling Britain that a woman who cooked a pudding from scratch was wasting her time. That is not progress. That is the calculated destruction of 700 years of working-class culinary knowledge in the service of a quarterly profit margin. She was right. Every single one of them was right. Comment below and tell me which one your grandmother made. You did not need anything else. The fruit provided sugar, the egg provided protein. The margarine provided fat, the spice provided warmth from the inside. A pound of mixed fruit cost 14 pence in 1972. The resulting cake fed a family for a week. Number 11. Sussex Pond Pudding. This is the one that confounds people most. The one where the magic is structural, built into the recipe itself, and when it works, it's extraordinary. and when it's described to someone who has never had it, they simply don't believe it's real. A suet pastry case lined into a basin. Inside, a whole lemon, unwaxed, a proper lemon, placed in the center, surrounded entirely by butter and demerara sugar. The basin sealed with a suet pastry lid, tied down, steamed for 3 to 4 hours, then inverted onto a plate. What has happened during those 3 hours? The butter and sugar have melted together, the lemon has cooked through entirely, its skin softened, its juice releasing slowly into the butter-sugar mixture. When you cut into the pudding at the table, a pond of lemon butter sugar sauce flows out from the center, hence the name. The lemon at the heart of it is eaten too, skin, pith, and all. The bitterness transformed by 3 hours of heat into something complex and extraordinary. This is a pudding that requires confidence, that requires faith. It rewards both absolutely. Number 10. Frumenti. The oldest pudding on this list by several centuries. Cracked or whole wheat grains, simmered in milk with saffron, sugar, and dried fruit, until the greens swell and soften, and the milk thickens around them into a golden, fragrant porridge. Eaten at feast days and holidays from the medieval period onwards, present in English cookery books from the 1400s through to the early 1900s, still served in rural Yorkshire and Lincolnshire at harvest festivals living memory can attest to. It was gone from most tables by 1950. By 1975, it was a historical curiosity. By 2000, it was virtually unknown. Today, the whole grains industry sells cracked wheat as bulgur. Restaurants serve wheatberry salads with pomegranate and feta and charge £12. Frumenti is what British people called wheatberry pudding for 700 years before anyone thought to repackage it as Middle Eastern grain cuisine. It is the same grain, the same saffron, the same slow cooking in milk. The price has merely been multiplied by 30. Number 9. Brown Betty. Not to be confused with the American version, this is a British pudding with its own distinct character. A baking dish buttered, a layer of stewed or raw sliced apple, a layer of buttered breadcrumbs mixed with brown sugar and a little cinnamon, another layer of apple, another layer of crumbs dotted with butter, baked until the top layer of crumbs turns deeply golden and smells of warm toffee, and the apple underneath has collapsed into a sweet, fragrant pool. Simpler than a crumble, fewer steps than a pie. No pastry to make, nothing that could go wrong. A brown Betty was the pudding a tired woman made on a Wednesday evening with yesterday's bread, and the apples in the bowl that were beginning to go soft. The soft apples were better for it. More juice, more collapse, more flavor from the concentrated sugars. In the North Midlands in the 1960s, this was a weekly event in houses with fruit trees. Every house with a garden had a fruit tree. Apples were not a purchased ingredient. Apples were something you walked outside and picked. Number 8. Egg custard tart. The real one. Not the Portuguese pastel de nata that the high street chains sell at 2.80 each, and whose flaky pastry and slightly burnt top have become the default British understanding of what a custard tart is. The English egg custard tart. Short crust pastry, not puff, not flaky, baked blind first until pale gold, then filled with a mixture of whole eggs, egg yolks, full-fat milk, cream if you had it, and nothing else except a pinch of nutmeg grated on top. Then returned to a very low oven and cooked slowly, slowly, until the custard just set and barely trembled. The nutmeg is not optional. The nutmeg is the thing. The specific combination of warm egg custard and freshly grated nutmeg is one of the oldest flavor pairings in British cooking. Present in cookery manuscripts from the 1600s, utterly distinctive, impossible to confuse with anything else. They were sold in every bakery in Britain through the 1970s. Singly, in a small foil case, 12 pence. You bought one and ate it walking home in the cold, and it was warm from the oven, and the nutmeg hit the back of your nose, and that was enough. That was entirely enough.